Get your dirty hands off that car, boy! The shout echoed across the upscale Washington, D.C. street as Officer Bradley Townsend stormed toward Dr. Jonathan Hayes, a distinguished black man in an expensive tailored suit who had just stepped out of his luxury sedan. Townsend shoved Hayes hard against the vehicle, forcing his hands onto the hood while curious pedestrians stopped to stare. Stealing cars in broad daylight now? I should have known better than to try this in my neighborhood. Hayes remained perfectly calm, his voice measured. Officer, I own this vehicle. Townsend laughed mockingly, twisting Hayes's arm behind his back. Right. And I'm the FBI director. He forced Hayes face down onto the car. Hands behind your head. Now. The growing crowd pulled out phones, recording every moment of the humiliation unfolding before them. Hayes' expensive watch caught the sunlight as his hands were forced into position. Have you ever watched someone's dignity get destroyed based purely on assumptions? What happens next will shatter everything you believe about power and justice in America. 6 hours earlier, Dr. Jonathan Hayes had started his morning like any other. His alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m. in his suburban Virginia home. Family photos lined the hallway, his wife Maria, their 2 teenage children, and pictures spanning a distinguished career in federal law enforcement. One frame showed a younger Hayes shaking hands with 3 different FBI directors over the years. The morning news played in the background as he prepared coffee. A reporter discussed recent police reform initiatives. Anonymous federal officials continue pushing for nationwide body camera requirements and enhanced oversight programs. Hayes adjusted his tie, listening intently. He knew more about those initiatives than the reporters could imagine. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Bradley Townsend was already complaining in the precinct locker room. More federal oversight bullshit, he grumbled to his partner. These Washington desk jockeys don't know real police work. Probably never even been in the field. His locker was decorated with photos from questionable arrests, almost exclusively young black men in handcuffs. A complaint file sat nearby, thick with unresolved allegations. Townsend had been investigated 7 times in 5 years. Each investigation mysteriously stalled or disappeared. I'm telling you, Martinez, Townsend continued, these feds think they can tell us how to do our jobs. Wait till one of them tries walking in our shoes. At FBI headquarters, Hayes reviewed briefings in his corner office. Awards and commendations covered the walls, but the nameplates were strategically angled away from the door. His secretary knocked. Director, your 6 p.m. community engagement is confirmed. The venue is downtown on 5th Street. Hayes nodded, closing a file marked Metropolitan Police Reform Initiative, Phase 2. Inside were statistics that would horrify the public. Arrest disparities, complaint patterns, and evidence of systematic misconduct across multiple precincts. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Don't work too late tonight. Sarah has a recital tomorrow. Leaving at 5:30, he typed back. Wouldn't miss it. Townsend spent his afternoon patrol targeting the same neighborhoods he always did. His radio crackled constantly with reports he ignored, focusing instead on luxury cars driven by black professionals. In 3 hours, he pulled over 4 vehicles. All drivers were black. All were released without tickets, but not before being subjected to extended searches and hostile questioning. His dashboard camera captured everything, but Townsend knew the footage rarely got reviewed. Internal affairs was overwhelmed, understaffed, and largely ineffective. He felt invincible. At 4:45 p.m., dispatch announced, all units, federal officials are conducting surprise inspections of body camera compliance. Ensure all equipment is functioning properly. Townsend cursed under his breath. He'd been forgetting to activate his camera for months. Today, he reluctantly switched it on. Hayes left headquarters precisely at 5:30, driving his personal vehicle to avoid attention. The community meeting was part of a listening tour he'd quietly organized. Tonight's topic, building trust between federal law enforcement and local communities. He was scheduled to speak anonymously, identified only as senior federal official. The irony wasn't lost on him. For months, he'd been crafting policies to address exactly the kind of misconduct that plagued departments nationwide. His reforms required body cameras, mandatory reporting, and federal oversight of police internal affairs. Many officers resented the changes without knowing their architect was a black man who'd experienced discrimination firsthand throughout his career. Townsend's radio buzzed. Unit 47 reports of suspicious activity on 5th Street. Luxury vehicle, possible theft in progress. I'll handle it, Townsend responded eagerly. 5th Street was his favorite hunting ground, upscale area where successful black professionals stuck out like sore thumbs, at least in his mind. Hayes parked outside the community center, checking his watch. 15 minutes early, as always. He straightened his tie, grabbed his briefcase, and stepped out of his sedan. From across the street, Townsend's patrol car pulled up. The officer's eyes immediately locked onto Hayes. Expensive car, tailored suit, confident posture. Everything that triggered his deepest prejudices and resentments. Townsend had no idea he was about to confront the most powerful law enforcement official in the country. Hayes had no idea his theoretical reforms were about to become brutally personal. The stage was set. Two men, representing opposite sides of American justice, were about to collide in a confrontation that would change everything. Neither could have predicted what would happen when assumptions met reality on that Washington, D.C. street corner. "Get your dirty hands off that car, boy!" Townsend's voice carried across the street as he slammed his patrol car door and marched toward Hayes with theatrical aggression. Hayes turned slowly, his expression controlled but alert. He'd been through this before, but never quite so publicly. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" "Don't play dumb with me," Townsend snarled, shoving Hayes hard against the sedan. The impact echoed off nearby buildings as pedestrians began to stop and stare. "Hands on the vehicle, now!" Hayes complied, placing his palms flat on the car's roof. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "This is my vehicle." Townsend laughed mockingly, beginning an aggressive pat-down that was more performance than procedure. "Your vehicle? Right. Let me guess. You're a doctor? A lawyer? Maybe a senator?" His voice dripped with sarcasm as he deliberately spoke loud enough for the growing crowd to hear every word. "I work for the federal government," Hayes replied calmly, his voice steady despite the humiliation. "Federal government!" Townsend howled with laughter, roughly yanking Hayes's wallet from his jacket pocket. "What are you, a janitor at the post office? Don't try to impress me with your fancy words, boy." By now, a dozen people had gathered on the sidewalk. Cell phones emerged, recording the encounter from multiple angles. Hayes noticed the cameras and felt a mixture of relief and dread. Evidence was being created, but his dignity was being destroyed in real time. Townsend examined Hayes's driver's license with exaggerated suspicion. "Dr. Jonathan E. Hayes," he read aloud mockingly. "Ooh, doctor. What kind of fake degree did you buy online?" He held the license up to the light theatrically. "Probably forged. The address says Fairfax County, real fancy neighborhood. No way someone like you lives there legitimately." "Officer, you can verify everything through your system," Hayes said, his voice remaining remarkably composed despite the escalating situation. "Don't tell me how to do my job," Townsend snapped, grabbing Hayes's shoulder and spinning him around to face the crowd. "You people think you can waltz into nice neighborhoods, steal cars, and nobody will notice? Well, I notice everything." The crowd was getting larger and more restless. A woman in business attire called out, "This is excessive force." An elderly man shook his head in disgust, but Townsend fed off the attention, puffing out his chest like a performer on stage. "Everyone needs to step back," Townsend barked at the crowd. "This is official police business. Anyone interfering will be arrested for obstruction." A backup officer, Rodriguez, arrived and immediately sensed something was wrong. He approached cautiously, studying Hayes's face with growing recognition. Something about the man seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. "What's the situation, Brad?" Rodriguez asked quietly. "Caught this one trying to steal this Mercedes," Townsend announced proudly. "Probably got the keys from some rich lady's purse. These people are getting bold, real bold." Rodriguez frowned, noticing Hayes's expensive watch, perfectly tailored suit, and most importantly, his calm, authoritative demeanor under pressure. This wasn't how car thieves typically behaved. Car thieves didn't quote legal procedures or maintain this level of composure. "Officer," Hayes addressed Rodriguez directly, maintaining eye contact, "I'm requesting your supervisor respond to this scene. This situation is escalating unnecessarily, and I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding." "Shut up," Townsend barked, forcing Hayes's hands behind his back more roughly than necessary. "Nobody called for backup opinions from the peanut gallery." He began searching the vehicle's interior, tossing papers onto the street with deliberate carelessness and obvious disrespect. Hayes' briefcase tumbled out of the passenger seat, falling open and scattering federal documents across the pavement. Rodriguez caught sight of official letterhead and stepped closer to examine them. His eyes widened as he read FBI Director on several documents, along with classification stamps and federal seals. "Brad," Rodriguez whispered urgently, tugging at his partner's sleeve, "maybe we should slow down here and—" "Maybe we should do what?" Townsend interrupted, not looking up from his theatrical search. "Let him go because he's wearing a nice suit? That's exactly the problem with cops today. No backbone, no respect for real police work." Hayes's phone began buzzing insistently in his jacket pocket. The caller ID, partially visible through the fabric, read, "Deputy Director Carter, urgent." Rodriguez saw it and felt his stomach drop like a stone. "Officer Townsend," Hayes said with increasing firmness and authority, "I'm strongly advising you to step back and reassess this situation. Contact your supervisor immediately. This is not going to end the way you think it will." "Advising me?" Townsend's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the surrounding buildings. "You're about to be in handcuffs, Einstein. You don't advise anybody. You don't tell me nothing." He leaned close to Hayes's ear, speaking just loud enough for the cameras to pick up every humiliating word. "Know your place, boy. This is my world, not yours. My streets, my rules." The crowd was growing larger by the minute, and their expressions were shifting from curiosity to outrage and disbelief. Someone shouted, "This is completely wrong." Another voice called out, "Leave that man alone." A teenager with her phone held high yelled, "This is going viral, officer!" Townsend fed off the attention like fuel on a fire, becoming more theatrical and aggressive with each passing moment. "Everyone stay back. This is official police business." He returned to searching the car, his movements becoming more destructive and disrespectful with each passing second. Then he found what he'd been looking for, or rather, what he'd brought with him. From his utility belt, Townsend palmed a small plastic baggie containing white powder. With practiced movements honed over dozens of similar encounters, he slipped it under the driver's seat during his search. "Well, well, well," he announced triumphantly, his voice carrying across the entire street. "What do we have here?" He held the baggie high for everyone to see, like a trophy. "Cocaine! Felony possession with intent to distribute." Hayes turned to face him directly, his eyes blazing with controlled fury and righteous indignation. "Officer, that substance is not mine, and you know exactly where it came from." "Right," Townsend smirked, waving the evidence like a flag. "They never is theirs. Cocaine just magically appears in cars all by itself, right? Just falls from the sky into luxury vehicles." He addressed the crowd mockingly. "This is going to be a real good arrest. Career criminal caught red-handed." Rodriguez stepped forward, deeply uncomfortable and increasingly panicked. "Brad, maybe we should test that substance before we make any official charges, or—" "Test it," Townsend laughed dismissively. "What's to test? Drugs are drugs, Rodriguez. Don't go soft on me now. Book him for felony possession." Hayes looked directly into the nearest camera phone, his voice clear and authoritative despite his compromised position. "I want everyone here to remember exactly what they're witnessing. Document everything you see. Record every word. Truth has a way of revealing itself, and when it does, there will be consequences. Truth? Townsend spat with obvious contempt. The truth is you're a drug dealer who thought his fancy car and expensive clothes would protect him from real police work. Well, guess what, Professor? Not in my precinct. Not on my watch. As Townsend reached for his handcuffs with obvious satisfaction, Hayes's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID was clearly visible to everyone nearby. FBI Deputy Director, emergency call. Rodriguez's face went completely pale as all the pieces began falling into place like a puzzle solving itself. He'd seen this man before, in federal briefings, on internal FBI communications, in official photographs with the Attorney General and other high-ranking officials. "Brad," he whispered desperately, grabbing his partner's arm, "I think we need to stop right now and... We need to arrest this drug dealer and get him off my streets," Townsend interrupted with complete confidence, utterly oblivious to the mounting evidence of his catastrophic mistake. "Game over, fancy boy. Welcome to the real world." But the real world was about to become something entirely different than what Officer Bradley Townsend had ever imagined possible. The handcuffs clicked shut around Hayes's wrists with a metallic finality that seemed to echo through the stunned crowd. Townsend practically strutted as he guided his prisoner toward the patrol car, savoring every moment of his perceived victory. "Watch your head," Townsend said with mock politeness, shoving Hayes into the back seat harder than necessary. "Wouldn't want you getting hurt before your court date, Doctor." He drew out the title with dripping sarcasm, then slammed the door with unnecessary force. Hayes sat quietly in the back seat, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. Through the window, he could see the crowd still recording, their faces a mixture of outrage and disbelief. He nodded slightly toward the cameras, a subtle acknowledgement that their documentation would prove crucial. Rodriguez climbed into the passenger seat, his hands shaking as he fastened his seatbelt. "Brad, I really think we should call the supervisor before we process this. Something doesn't feel right about—" "What doesn't feel right?" Townsend interrupted, pulling away from the curb. "Is that you're questioning a textbook arrest. Stolen vehicle, drug possession, resisting arrest. It's Christmas morning, Rodriguez." "He wasn't resisting arrest," Rodriguez said quietly. "He was arguing with me. That's resisting in my book. In the back seat, Hayes remained silent, but his mind was working methodically through the situation. His phone had stopped buzzing, which meant his staff would be implementing emergency protocols within minutes. Deputy Director Carter would have already initiated a location trace when the first call went unanswered. At the precinct, word was already spreading in whispers. Desk Sergeant Williams had seen Hayes during booking procedures and recognized him immediately from federal law enforcement conferences. His face had gone white, but he'd said nothing, uncertain of the proper protocol for such an unprecedented situation. "Martinez," Williams quietly called to another officer, "make sure the holding cells are clean, and get me the watch commander's number. Now!" Townsend strutted through the precinct doors like a conquering hero, pulling Hayes along roughly by the arm. "Got ourselves a real prize tonight, boys. Car thief with a drug habit and a fancy vocabulary." Hayes maintained his composure as they processed him, providing information in clear, measured tones that further unsettled the desk staff. When asked for his occupation, he stated simply, "Federal law enforcement." "Federal law enforcement," Townsend mocked loudly enough for the entire booking area to hear. "Probably a security guard at the Social Security office. These people always inflate their job titles." During the fingerprinting process, Hayes requested his one phone call. Townsend grinned maliciously. "Sure thing, Doctor. Call your dealer and tell him to find a new corner to work." Hayes was escorted to the phone, his handcuffs temporarily removed. He dialed a number from memory and waited. When someone answered, his words were quiet but precise. "This is Director Hayes. I'm currently in custody at the 5th Precinct. Implement Protocol 7 immediately." The desk sergeant overheard and nearly choked on his coffee. Protocol 7 was federal code for an emergency involving high-ranking law enforcement officials. Townsend snatched the phone away. "Time's up, hotshot. Back to your cell." As Hayes was led to holding, other detainees looked up with surprise. The man in the expensive suit didn't belong here, and his calm, authoritative presence was unmistakable even in handcuffs. "What are you in for?" asked one detainee. "A misunderstanding that's about to become very expensive for some people," Hayes replied quietly. Outside the precinct, black SUVs with government plates were beginning to arrive. Federal agents in dark suits emerged, their expressions grim and purposeful. They moved with military precision toward the precinct entrance. "Watch." Commander Peterson was in his office when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "Commander, this is Deputy Director Carter, FBI. We believe you have Director Jonathan Hayes in custody. I need to speak with whoever authorized his arrest immediately." Peterson's face was drained of color. "Did you say Director Hayes? FBI Director Hayes?" "That's correct, Commander. And I suggest you handle this situation very carefully from this point forward." Peterson's hands shook as he hung up the phone. He immediately called for Townsend and Rodriguez to report to his office, then began reviewing the arrest report with growing horror. Meanwhile, Townsend was celebrating with other officers in the break room. "Took down a real smooth operator tonight. Thought his fancy suit would save him, but justice is colorblind, boys." His radio crackled. "Officer Townsend, report to the watch commander immediately." "Probably wants to congratulate me," Townsend grinned, straightening his uniform. "Biggest arrest of the month, guaranteed." Rodriguez followed reluctantly. The federal documents he'd seen scattered on the street burned into his memory. He'd tried to search for FBI Director Hayes on his phone, but the precinct's internet connection was notoriously slow. As they walked toward Peterson's office, neither officer noticed the group of federal agents entering the building, their badges clearly visible, their expressions deadly serious. The system was about to correct itself in ways that Townsend couldn't possibly imagine. The man he'd humiliated and arrested was about to reveal exactly who he was, and the consequences would ripple through every level of law enforcement. Justice was coming, and it wore a federal badge. Watch Commander Peterson stood behind his desk, his face ashen as he stared at the arrest report. The federal agents flanking him looked like they could cut glass with their expressions. Deputy Director Carter stepped forward, her voice ice-cold with barely controlled fury. "Commander Peterson, I need Officer Townsend and his partner brought in here immediately, and I mean immediately." Peterson pressed his intercom button with a trembling finger. "Townsend and Rodriguez, to my office, now." Townsend swaggered down the hallway, still basking in his perceived triumph. "Bet the commander wants the full story," he told Rodriguez with a cocky grin. "Wait till he hears about the cocaine I found. This arrest is going to look great in my file." Rodriguez said nothing, his stomach churning with dread. The federal documents he'd seen kept flashing through his mind, but he hadn't been able to process their full significance until now. They knocked and entered Peterson's office. Townsend's confidence evaporated instantly when he saw the room full of federal agents in dark suits, their expressions ranging from disgusted to murderous. "Officer Townsend," Peterson's voice cracked slightly, "do you want to tell me exactly who you arrested tonight?" "Some car thief with delusions of grandeur," Townsend replied, but his voice had lost its earlier bravado. "Called himself a doctor, claimed to work for the federal government. Classic criminal behavior, inflate the resume, hope for leniency." Deputy Director Carter stepped forward, her FBI badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Officer Townsend, let me introduce myself. I'm Deputy Director Sarah Carter, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The man you arrested tonight is my boss." Townsend's face began to drain of color. "Your boss?" "FBI Director Jonathan Hayes," Carter continued, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "The highest-ranking law enforcement official in the United States. The man whose policies have been reshaping police departments nationwide. The man you handcuffed, humiliated, and charged with felony drug possession. The words hit Townsend like physical blows. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as the full magnitude of his mistake crashed down on him. Rodriguez closed his eyes and whispered a prayer under his breath. "That's impossible," Townsend stammered. "He was stealing a car. I found drugs." "You found drugs that you planted," Agent Morrison interrupted, stepping forward with a tablet displaying crystal-clear body camera footage. "We've reviewed everything. Your camera, Rodriguez's camera, and 12 civilian cell phone videos. We watched you palm the baggie and slip it under the seat." Townsend's legs gave out slightly, and he grabbed the back of a chair for support. I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know." Carter's voice rose with controlled rage. "You saw a successful black man in an expensive car, and your prejudice did the thinking for you. Your bias was so complete, so overwhelming, that you couldn't see reality even when it was staring you in the face." Peterson found his voice. "Officer Townsend, you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Badge and weapons. Now." With shaking hands, Townsend began removing his badge. The metal felt impossibly heavy as he placed it on Peterson's desk. His service weapon followed with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the silent room. "Where is Director Hayes now?" Carter demanded. "Holding cell number 3, Peterson whispered. "Get him, immediately, and remove those handcuffs with a formal apology." As Peterson rushed out, Carter turned back to Townsend, who looked like he might collapse at any moment. "Do you understand what you've done? The man you arrested has been fighting police misconduct his entire career. He's the architect of every reform program you've been complaining about. The body camera requirements, the federal oversight protocols, the enhanced training programs, all his initiatives." Rodriguez spoke up quietly. "Ma'am, I tried to stop him. I recognized some of the documents, tried to get him to slow down, but we know, Officer Rodriguez. Your conduct will be reviewed separately, but preliminary evidence suggests you attempted to prevent this disaster." Footsteps echoed in the hallway as Peterson returned with Hayes, whose handcuffs were being removed by a deeply embarrassed sergeant. Hayes rubbed his wrists calmly, his dignity intact despite the ordeal. "Director Hayes," Carter approached him with obvious relief and concern. "Sir, are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine, Sarah," Hayes replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of everything he'd just experienced. "But we have work to do." Hayes turned to face Townsend, who couldn't meet his eyes. The room fell completely silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and Townsend's labored breathing. "Officer Townsend," Hayes said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Look at me." Townsend slowly raised his head, his face a mask of shame and terror. "Do you understand what happened here tonight?" Hayes continued. "Hayes, you didn't just arrest an innocent man. You exposed a systemic problem that goes far deeper than one officer's prejudice. Your actions tonight have given us a case study in everything that's wrong with modern policing." "Director, I'm sorry, I didn't know who you were." "That's exactly the problem," Hayes replied, his voice gaining strength. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with basic human dignity. You shouldn't need to see my badge to follow proper procedures. You shouldn't need my federal authority to prevent you from planting evidence." The room remained frozen as Hayes continued. "Every assumption you made tonight was based on the color of my skin. My education, my career, my character, my intentions. None of it mattered to you because you couldn't see past your own prejudice." Townsend's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What happens now?" Chen answered before Hayes could respond. "Federal civil rights investigation. Criminal charges for evidence tampering, false arrest, and violation of civil rights under color of law. And that's just the beginning." Hayes straightened his tie and looked around the room at the assembled officers and agents. "What happens now is that we use this incident to create real change. This stops being about one bad officer and becomes about fixing a broken system." He turned to Peterson. "Commander, I want every arrest Townsend has made in the past 2 years reviewed by federal investigators. Every complaint, every use of force incident, every traffic stop. If there's a pattern, we're going to expose it. The transformation was complete. The humiliated victim had revealed himself as the most powerful law enforcement official in the country. The hunter had become the hunted. And justice, delayed but not denied, was finally beginning to unfold. Officer Bradley Townsend's world had just collapsed entirely, and he was only beginning to understand the true cost of his prejudice and misconduct. The FBI field office buzzed with intense activity as Director Hayes established a comprehensive task force within hours of his release. Agent Morrison pulled up digital files on multiple monitors while forensics specialists examined the planted evidence under microscopes. The scale of the investigation was unprecedented. A sitting FBI director had been the victim of police misconduct, creating a federal case with massive implications that would ripple through law enforcement nationwide. Director, we've completed the preliminary evidence analysis, Agent Rodriguez reported, not to be confused with the police officer. The substance Townsend planted was powdered sugar mixed with baking soda. Street value, approximately 50 cents. But the federal charges he'll face carry 25 years to life in federal prison. Hayes nodded grimly, reviewing body camera footage on his laptop. The video was damning. 12 different angles showing Townsend's evidence planting, his racist language, and his complete disregard for proper procedure. Every frame told the story of systematic abuse of power. What about his arrest history? I want everything. That's where it gets deeply disturbing, sir, Morrison replied, pulling up database records that filled 3 large monitors. Townsend has made 847 arrests in 5 years. 723 of them were black males between ages 18 and 55. That's an 85.4% rate in a district that's only 31% black population. The statistical improbability alone suggests targeting, Hayes concluded, his analytical mind processing the numbers. Exactly. And here's the smoking gun. 89% of his drug possession charges were later dismissed or reduced due to procedural issues, lack of evidence, or prosecutorial concerns about case integrity. Hayes felt his jaw tighten as the implications sank in. Meaning the evidence was questionable or manufactured from the start. We've identified at least 47 cases with identical patterns, expensive cars, professional-looking black men between 25-50, mysterious drug discoveries during routine traffic stops that somehow escalated to vehicle searches. The pattern is so consistent it's like he was following a playbook. Hayes stood up and began pacing, his mind working through the legal and systemic implications. Each statistic represented a life disrupted, a family torn apart, a career potentially destroyed by one officer's systematic prejudice and criminal behavior. Deputy Director Carter entered with a thick file and a grim expression. Sir, we've got victim testimonies pouring in faster than we can process them. Word spread quickly about Townsend's arrest through social media, and people are coming forward with similar experiences. The stories are heartbreaking and remarkably consistent. She opened the file, revealing photographs and case summaries. Dr. Michael Thompson, prominent cardiovascular surgeon, was arrested for suspicious behavior outside his own hospital at 11 p.m. after a 16-hour surgery. Spent the night in jail, missed 3 scheduled operations. The hospital had to issue a public apology to patients. Hayes examined the photo, a distinguished black man in his 40s, still wearing scrubs in his mugshot. Professor James Washington, tenured economics professor at Georgetown, pulled over 17 times in 2 years driving to and from campus. All charges dismissed, but his students started a petition demanding university security escort him to his car each evening. How many confirmed victims total? Documented and verified? 63 individuals, but we're expecting that number to triple as word spreads through community networks. The NAACP is organizing victim outreach meetings, and local news stations are running stories encouraging people to come forward. Chen pulled out another section of the file. Attorney David Johnson, handcuffed in front of his twin 7-year-old daughters for matching a suspect description that was described as black male, average height, wearing clothing. The girls are still in therapy 8 months later. Hayes closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of systematic injustice. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a calculated pattern of harassment and abuse that had destroyed trust in law enforcement throughout entire communities. Schedule a recorded interview with Townsend. I want to conduct it personally. Sir, is that legally advisable? You're the primary victim in this case. Defense attorneys could argue. That's exactly why I need to do it, Sarah. The victims in his other cases never got the chance to confront their abuser directly. They never got to look him in the eye and demand answers. Someone needs to speak for them, and as the highest-ranking law enforcement official in this country, that responsibility falls to me. 3 days later, Hayes sat across from Townsend in a sterile interview room at the federal building. The former officer looked like he'd aged 15 years, unshaven, hollow-eyed, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he signed waiver forms declining legal representation for the recorded interview. His uniform had been replaced with an orange jumpsuit, a visible symbol of his fall from authority to criminal defendant. State your full name and former occupation for the record, Hayes began, his voice professionally neutral but carrying unmistakable authority. Bradley James Townsend, former police officer, 5th Precinct, Metropolitan Police Department. His voice was barely audible, broken. Mr. Townsend, do you understand why you're here today? Because I arrested you without knowing who you were. Hayes leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Townsend's face. No. You're here because you systematically violated the civil rights of American citizens over a period of years. My federal position is completely irrelevant to these charges. You would have done the same thing to a janitor, a teacher, a student, or an unemployed person. Isn't that correct? Townsend's silence stretched uncomfortably long, filled only by the hum of recording equipment and air conditioning. Let me rephrase the question more directly. How many innocent black men have you arrested under similar fabricated circumstances? I don't know what you mean by that. Hayes opened a thick folder methodically, the pages making soft rustling sounds in the quiet room. Marcus Williams, age 34, was arrested for drug possession outside his own law office at 7 p.m. after working late on a client case. Charges dropped when security footage showed no suspicious activity. Kevin Davis, age 28, arrested for car theft while loading groceries into his own vehicle in broad daylight. Vehicle registration confirmed his ownership. Charges dropped. Antonio Martinez, age 31, arrested for possession after being pulled over for erratic driving on a completely straight road with no traffic violations. Should I continue reading, Mr. Townsend? Those were legitimate arrests based on what evidence? Hayes interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like steel. Based on what probable cause? Based on what reasonable suspicion beyond the color of their skin? Townsend's composure began cracking visibly. Look, I made some mistakes, okay? But I was trying to do my job. Those neighborhoods have high crime rates, drug problems. The neighborhood where you arrested me has one of the lowest crime rates in the Metropolitan District, Hayes interrupted, consulting his notes. 0.3 violent crimes per 1,000 residents. Try again. People like you coming into neighborhoods where they don't belong. Townsend started, then stopped abruptly, realizing his mistake. People like me? Hayes leaned forward, his voice dangerously quiet. Please finish that sentence, Mr. Townsend. I'm very interested in hearing your complete thoughts. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Townsend mumbled, I don't know what I meant by that. You meant black people. You saw my skin color and made every assumption that followed from that single observation. My education level, my criminal history, my right to drive an expensive car, my right to exist in that neighborhood, my right to be treated with basic human dignity, all determined by racial prejudice. Hayes pulled out crime scene photos showing the planted evidence, spreading them across the table methodically. Explain this baggie to me, Mr. Townsend. I found it in your car during a routine search. Mr. Townsend, we have 12 different camera angles showing you palm this substance from your utility belt and place it under my driver's seat during what you call a routine search. We have forensic evidence proving it's household baking soda mixed with powdered sugar. We have your fingerprints on the baggie, but absolutely no traces of the substance anywhere else in my vehicle. Do you want to reconsider your answer? Townsend stared at the table, his shoulders slumping in defeat. How many other times, Mr. Townsend? How many other innocent people did you frame with planted evidence? I never meant to hurt innocent people. That's not what I asked you. I asked for a number. How many? The question hung in the air like a sword of justice waiting to fall. Finally, Townsend whispered, "Sometimes evidence gets overlooked during initial searches. Sometimes you find things on a second look that weren't visible the first time." That's still not answering my question. I asked how many innocent people you knowingly framed with planted evidence. Townsend's voice became barely audible, each word extracted like a confession at gunpoint. Maybe a few times, when I knew someone was guilty of something but couldn't prove it in court. I was trying to get drugs off the streets, trying to protect the community. Hayes felt a cold fury building in his chest, but his voice remained professionally controlled. You mean you appointed yourself judge and jury? You decided who was guilty based on your personal prejudices, and then manufactured evidence to support predetermined conclusions. The interview continued for 3 more grueling hours. Hayes methodically walked through case after case, extracting admissions that painted a picture of systematic misconduct spanning 5 years and affecting dozens of families. Townsend's defense crumbled under the weight of overwhelming evidence and Hayes's relentless, methodical questioning that leveraged decades of investigative experience. When the interview finally concluded, Hayes stood and straightened his suit jacket with deliberate precision. Mr. Townsend, your actions didn't just harm individual victims. You systematically undermined public trust in law enforcement, corrupted the justice system at its foundation, and violated the oath you swore to uphold when you became a police officer. The federal government will prosecute you to the fullest extent of federal law. As Hayes reached the door, Townsend called out desperately, his voice cracking with panic. What if I cooperate fully? What if I help identify other cases, other officers who might be engaged in similar practices? Hayes turned back slowly, his expression unchanged. Cooperation with ongoing federal investigations might influence sentencing recommendations from the prosecutor's office. But understand this clearly, Mr. Townsend. Your cooperation doesn't erase the lives you've damaged, the families you've torn apart, or the institutional trust you've systematically destroyed. Justice delayed is still justice. It's just finally caught up with you. Outside the interview room, Carter was waiting with comprehensive updates and a team of federal prosecutors. Sir, the investigation has expanded exponentially. We're now looking at 12 other officers with similar statistical patterns and complaint histories. Internal affairs files show systematic dismissal of citizen complaints, evidence irregularities, and arrest demographics that mirror Townsend's criminal profile. What's the community response been? Mixed but overwhelmingly positive from affected communities. Victim advocacy groups are calling this a watershed moment in police accountability. Civil rights organizations are praising federal intervention as long overdue. Surprisingly, even some police unions are acknowledging the need for comprehensive reform after reviewing the video evidence. Hayes nodded grimly. This investigation can't be solely about punishment, Sarah. It has to fundamentally be about prevention and systematic reform. I want comprehensive policy recommendations on my desk within the week. Mandatory body camera protocols, evidence handling procedures, bias recognition training, civilian oversight mechanisms, everything. Already in development, sir. And the director? Officer Rodriguez from that night has requested an urgent meeting. He wants to discuss what he witnessed and how similar situations could be systematically prevented in the future. Hayes smiled slightly. his first genuine smile since the arrest. "Schedule it immediately. If we're going to fix this broken system, we desperately need officers who are willing to be part of comprehensive solutions." The investigation was expanding daily, but justice was finally in motion with federal authority behind it. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was packed with victims, community leaders, and media representatives as Judge Patricia Williams prepared to deliver Townsend's sentence. The former officer sat at the defendant's table, a broken man who had pleaded guilty to 15 federal felony charges, including civil rights violations, evidence tampering, conspiracy under color of law, and systematic deprivation of constitutional rights. "Mr. Townsend," Judge Williams began, her voice carrying the weight of justice long delayed, "in 30 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a comprehensive pattern of abuse of power and violation of public trust. Your actions represent everything that is wrong with policing in America today." Hayes sat in the front row of the gallery, surrounded by dozens of Townsend's victims who had finally gotten their day in court. Dr. Michael Thompson, the surgeon who had missed critical operations, sat beside Professor James Washington, whose students had organized campus safety escorts. Attorney David Johnson held photographs of his twin daughters, now 9 years old, and still asking why police officers had handcuffed their father. "The evidence presented in this case," Judge Williams continued, "reveals a systematic campaign of racial profiling, evidence fabrication, and constitutional violations that affected at least 63 documented victims over a 5-year period. Mr. Townsend, you didn't just break the law. You perverted it." Townsend's defense attorney had argued for leniency, citing his client's cooperation with the federal investigation that had exposed 12 other officers and led to the overturning of 247 wrongful convictions. But the prosecution, led by federal attorneys working directly with Hayes's task force, had presented overwhelming evidence of systematic misconduct that demanded severe consequences. "Before I pronounce the sentence," Judge Williams said, "I want to address the broader implications of this case. When Director Hayes was arrested that evening, he could have used his federal authority to make this incident disappear quietly. Instead, he chose to expose systematic injustice and create lasting change." Hayes had testified extensively during the trial, his calm, methodical presentation of evidence providing a stark contrast to Townsend's earlier arrogance. The courtroom recordings of their interview had become required viewing in police academies nationwide, showing how prejudice could blind officers to basic humanity and professional responsibility. "The federal investigation triggered by this incident," the judge continued, "has resulted in comprehensive reform across 17 police departments, mandatory bias training for 4,200 officers, and the implementation of enhanced civilian oversight programs in 12 major cities." The reforms had been swift and comprehensive. Hayes had worked directly with Congress to pass the Federal Police Accountability Act, requiring body cameras for all federal grant recipients, creating national databases of police misconduct, and establishing federal oversight of departments with patterns of civil rights violations. Officer Rodriguez, who had tried unsuccessfully to stop Townsend that night, had been promoted to training supervisor and was now leading bias recognition programs across the region. His testimony about the incident had become a cornerstone of reformed police training, showing how good officers could and must intervene when colleagues engaged in misconduct. "Mr. Townsend," Judge Williams addressed the defendant directly, "you will serve 8 years in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will pay $347,000 in restitution to documented victims, and you are permanently barred from any law enforcement position." Gasps of satisfaction rippled through the courtroom as victims and their families finally heard justice pronounced. Hayes remained stoic, but he felt a deep sense of completion as the legal system finally held a systematic abuser accountable. "Additionally," the judge continued, "this court is ordering the creation of the Hayes Commission on Police Reform, to be chaired by Director Hayes, with a mandate to develop national standards for police conduct, evidence handling, and civilian oversight." After the sentencing, Hayes addressed a crowd of reporters and community members outside the courthouse. Today's sentence sends a clear message that systematic abuse of power will not be tolerated in American law enforcement, he said, his voice carrying across the courthouse steps. But punishment alone is insufficient. Real change requires institutional reform, cultural transformation, and unwavering commitment to constitutional principles. The statistics spoke to the broader impact. Complaints against police had dropped 60% in districts implementing Hayes's reforms. Use of force incidents had declined by 45%. Most importantly, community trust in law enforcement was slowly beginning to rebuild in neighborhoods that had been systematically targeted. Dr. Thompson approached Hayes after the press conference. "Director, I wanted to thank you personally. My daughters can now see police officers without fear. That's worth more than any settlement check." Hayes shook his hand firmly. "Dr. Thompson, your courage in coming forward helped make this possible. Justice belongs to all of us, not just those with federal badges." The Townsend case had become a watershed moment in American policing, proof that the system could correct itself when individuals had the courage to demand accountability and the authority to enforce it. Justice, though delayed, had finally arrived with consequences that would reshape law enforcement for generations to come. 1 year later, Director Hayes returned to the exact spot where Officer Townsend had humiliated and arrested him. The downtown Washington, D.C. street looked the same, but everything had changed. A small memorial plaque now marked the location, reading, "In recognition of all victims of police misconduct and the ongoing fight for justice and equality." The community center across the street buzzed with activity as Hayes arrived for the first annual Police Accountability Summit. Inside, a diverse crowd of police chiefs, community leaders, civil rights activists, and reformed officers gathered to discuss progress and challenges in law enforcement reform. Officer Rodriguez, now Captain Rodriguez and head of the Metropolitan Police Training Division, greeted Hayes at the entrance. "Director, the body camera compliance is at 98% nationwide. Use of force incidents are down 52% from last year. But more importantly, recruit training now includes 40 hours of bias recognition and constitutional rights education." Hayes smiled, genuinely pleased with the systemic changes. "How's the community response?" "Mixed but improving steadily. Trust takes time to rebuild, but we're seeing positive engagement in neighborhoods that hadn't cooperated with police in years." Inside the summit, Hayes addressed an audience that included many of Townsend's former victims, now transformed into advocates for justice reform. Dr. Thompson had established a foundation providing legal aid to police misconduct victims. Professor Washington was developing a curriculum for police cultural competency training. Attorney Johnson's daughters, now 10 years old, had written letters to police academies nationwide about treating everyone with dignity. "Systematic change doesn't happen overnight," Hayes told the packed auditorium. "It requires constant vigilance, continuous education, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional bias and abuse of power." The statistics displayed behind him told a story of genuine progress. 847 wrongful convictions overturned, $12.3 million in victim compensation distributed, 17 police departments reformed, and 43 officers prosecuted for systematic misconduct revealed during the expanded investigation. Townsend remained in federal prison, serving his 8-year sentence. Recent reports indicated he was participating in rehabilitation programs and had written letters of apology to his victims, though many remained skeptical of his sincerity. "The most important lesson from that night," Hayes continued, "isn't that the system worked perfectly, but that it worked eventually when good people demanded accountability and refused to accept injustice as inevitable." Hayes concluded his remarks by addressing the cameras broadcasting the summit live across the country. "Real change happens when ordinary citizens refuse to be silent witnesses to injustice. When you see misconduct, document it. When you witness bias, challenge it. When systems fail, demand reform." The audience stood in sustained applause as Hayes stepped down from the podium. Community leaders embraced federal agents, reformed officers shared stories with civil rights activists, and victims found strength in collective action toward justice. Outside, Hayes paused at the memorial plaque one final time. A young black boy, maybe 8 years old, was reading the inscription with his mother. The boy looked up at Hayes and smiled without fear or suspicion, something that might not have been possible before the reforms took hold. As Hayes walked to his car, his phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Sarah. "Saw your speech online, Dad. Proud of you for turning something terrible into something meaningful." That evening, Hayes sat in his home office, drafting policy recommendations for the next phase of police reform. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. Justice delayed had become justice delivered, and systematic change was finally replacing systematic oppression. Have you ever witnessed misconduct and stayed silent? Have you seen injustice and assumed someone else would act? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story moved you to think differently about speaking up for justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about accountability, reform, and the ongoing fight for equality. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that change is possible when good people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Because the truth is simple. Democracy and justice only work when citizens actively participate in protecting them. Your voice matters. Your witness matters. Your courage to demand better can literally change the world.